Hey Neppers, it's me, Wild Neptune. Welcome to my first ever Hearthstone video. As this is my first video, bit of a background quickly. I've been playing since closed beta, on and off, so from beta to about RocketsCon's Rumble. Then I took a break, came back to Skullomance, took a little bit of a break, came back during Barons, took a little bit of a break, came back during Badlands, been playing since then. Been having a time. I suppose I play both Standard and Wild. Standard a little bit more so. Also play some Battlegrounds too. That's basically everything, and now let's get going. This video is going to be about mid-range decks. Are they doomed to die in Hearthstone? If you're new to Hearthstone, or card games in general, a mid-range deck is one that is between mid-range and control, hence mid-range. They tend to like to win in the middle of the game. Around 7, 8, 9 mana is when they have capped out traditionally. However, over time, of course, as the game has evolved, has changed, this has also changed, and now mid-range decks definitely lean more towards the control-y side these days when they do exist. Right now, there aren't that many in the format, but we'll look at a couple of them, also some ones from the past, and why I think they are in danger and how history has told us that. This right here is a classic style GVG mid-range hunter. Not an exact list, but the closest one I could find to what I was looking for. You see right here, like it will start controlling the board with things like its traps, get your secrets out, and then around turn 3 or so, start hitting face with like Always Huffer, Bow, close out with Kill Command, Dr. Boom, sometimes we'll run Ragnaros, stuff like that. Drop your Lotheb to seal the deal. Usually want to win, again, by the turn 7 or 8. Pretty aggressive as early as turn 2 or 3. Another mid-range deck that was a little bit later on would be mid-range Shaman. It would be going face quite a bit, set up a tiny bit with Spirit Claws, get your Tunnel Trog out, and then drop your Overload cards, including your 7 mana, your 4 mana, 7/7, drop your Things for Below for free, go face with your Fire Elemental, which only did 3 damage at the time, and I believe was not even a 6/5. But, yeah, now, these mid-range decks you see are actually quite aggressive, and if you did not know, at the time, they were considered to be the best decks in the format. Let's look at some current mid-range decks. I think the mid-range deck that most people are familiar with right now in the current format and standard is Rainbow Death Knight. You will notice here it has some of the early game, but it definitely has even more late game going for it. And one of the reasons why this is, and this is basically a blanket for all mid-range decks in the current year, 2024, is that you need a lot of gas to hit through what the control decks can do, or I guess the control deck, that being Warrior these days, or you just can't kill them. So you need some of this late game scam, because otherwise they just kill all your minions, in the middle and early game, or just don't care, because if you're not an aggro deck, you don't have enough pressure to actually kill them in time. So you need some of this late game stuff in order to seal the deal or survive just a little bit longer to get it done. But this deck, was pretty good, but the changes have not been kind to it. Also, another deck I consider to be mid-range in a way is Reno Hunter. This case, Breakfast Hunter, called so because it uses Mystery Egg. Now, there are actually a lot of versions of this deck running around. Some Reno, some not Reno. A lot of it sprung by the changes to Reno itself, so no longer just killed by all the plagues. Also, the buff to Tyrannosaurus, a card I never thought would actually see play. So I'm saying with Egg. Although I guess Egg always had potential. But again, wants to control earlier on with his taunt, secret, stuff like that, the weapon, stuff like that, and then go into his late game. But is this deck good because it's flexible, because it's mid-range? No. It's good because of the scam it can run, the late game push. Now, to be fair, the deck doesn't have as much value, as much late game as something like, say, Druid or Rogue. Dex classes that are slowly rising up since the changes, and definitely not as much as Warrior, but more so than aggro decks. So what happened? Why is mid-range gone from the predominant strategy, the best strategy in a lot of cases, to one that is struggling these days? Well, a number of reasons. One of the first ones is that mid-range as a strategy will always suffer the most due to power creep. If you come here from my Epic 7 days, you'll know that bruiser units, which are basically mid-range units in that game, were one of my favorite types of strategies. And they were very, very strong early in the history of the game. But as the game aged and power creep happened, well, we got tanks that could do as much damage as bruisers, and also glass cannons that were not glass cannons because they also take as many hits as bruisers also, leaving that middle end kind of, lacking a bit. In addition to that, we also, in Hearthstone, suffer the same problems here. We have decks like Spell Token Hunter, which I think is, again, a relatively fair deck overall. It just has so many good aggressive tools that mid-range decks, it just can't use all of them, and it can't use all of them effectively. Or we have really, really strong control decks like Highlander Warrior. Yes, mid-range decks can use some of these cards like, Reno, Ziliac, stuff like that, Burrow, stuff, and other things, but not as effectively and not as synergistically as a dedicated control deck. It is really hard to make cards that are only good or really exemplify what a mid-range deck is and what they try to do. Another factor is that mid-range decks right now lack good win conditions. When Denatrius was in the game, a lot of mid-range decks could use it just to seal the game. Like, every single deck had the ability to have a strong win condition. Same thing with a card like Astalor. Every deck had a card that could be used to be a strong win condition. Now, I would argue that having singular cards being good as a win condition for every single deck is not good for the game, but they did help mid-range decks have a place in the meta when they were in the game. But now they don't really have them, and that is a big problem. I mean, again, before, you could have decks like your Highlander Hunter, which just basically played good cards. I come from Yu-Gi-Oh! And in Yu-Gi-Oh! We have a term called good stuff. I actually think it comes from Magic the Gathering, like a lot of card games terms do. But good stuff is just a deck that ran the best cards possible that had some sort of playability, right? No real synergies, just, Heavy Storm, Pot of Greed, Monster Reborn, all those good cards like that were in a good stuff deck. And that's what I feel like a lot of earlier decks in Hearthstone were. And a lot of those decks ended up being mid-range decks. But that doesn't really work anymore. Now you have to run things with good synergies and with concrete win conditions. Take a deck like Rainbow Mage. Now, when this deck does win, which it doesn't a lot of the times now because of the nerfs to Miracle Salesman, you would basically win the game by working towards your Sif and buffing it up. A deck like even Plague Death Knight, you basically win by being more of a control deck and winning with your plagues. This really differs greatly. Like, you can tell me, if you know enough about the game, how Plague Death Knight is going to win you a match of Hearthstone. If you were a player who didn't know anything about Rainbow Death Knight, can you tell me how this is going to win? Probably not. And that is one of the big issues with mid-range decks, is that its win conditions are not always very clear. The third reason, and maybe the most important one overall, in why mid-range has kind of faltered and why it's not really pushed that much, is that I believe players don't see the mid-range deck or mid-range play as very exciting or very fun. People don't like incremental gaining advantage over the course of a few turns. No, they want these big flashy plays. They want to play a lot of cards, do a lot of things, and feel like, boom, they accomplish a lot of stuff in a single turn. In a way, this mirrors kind of what happened to Yu-Gi-Oh! Where before, earlier in that game, you would make slow, incremental plays to gain advantage, and then, boom, you would go in for the win. These days, not the case. These days, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is about preventing your opponent from actually playing the game, but that's a video for another day. I would say that cards like, say, old Shutterwalk, like the original one, why was this card very popular? Was because it was good when it first out? No, in fact, this deck wasn't that good when it was first released. Eventually, the deck became really, really good in Wild, I believe, but in Standard, it wasn't really that great. People played it because of how flashy it was. Of course, we have some outliers, like, say, the old Yogg Saron, which was both flashy, random, and good, which is, again, not really good for the state of the game. But, again, people just like flashy, big plays. And that doesn't really exist that much in a lot of mid-range decks. Another factor, of course, is going to be gameplay. In front of you is a screenshot I took of a game I had last season. I was playing Spell Mage, so that's why my rank is pretty crappy. But, you know, I have a chance to win until turn 3, obviously, against a Paladin. Look at this. Like, how is anybody, any deck that is not an aggro deck that can maybe stop this from happening in the first place, or a control deck that can maybe clear the board over a couple of turns and not die right away, supposed to combat this? They're not. Like, mid-range is just so behind something like this that why even play it, right? It's just boggling. This is Standard, by the way. He's at 3 mana, and then you also have things like the Giant Scan. So you look at something like this. Again, you just saw that deck at Sea Giant, but the Warlock decks, they run Molten Giant. Drop them on what? Turn 4, right? Turn 5 in the middle of the game. Or you have Playhouse Giant. When do Rogues drop it? Oh, I don't know. Turn 5, turn 6, middle of the game. These other decks that are not really mid-range, more like combo-oriented or aggro-oriented, can just play their big minions in the middle of the game, and you're, oh, like, my little mid-range deck, what am I doing? Oh, I don't know, I'm dropping, like, Mystery Egg, right? Or I'm playing, like, Deldarin, right? Maybe I'm playing, like, a Taunt, 1 minion, for 6 mana, not even cheated out, right? That's all I'm doing. You feel really, really bad, and you fall really far behind these other decks that are, again, not really mid-range decks, but have more of a power spike in the middle of the game than these so-called mid-range ones. Well, that's just my rant on mid-range decks and how I miss them and how they are suffering right now in the current format in Hearthstone. But tell me down below, do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think mid-range is ready for a comeback? Do you even want them to come back in the first place? Tell me down below. If you like this content, but see more like it, hit subscribe, like all the good stuff. Anyway, I'm Wild Neptune. It's been a good one. Nep out.